Hello there, and welcome to the EFG London Jazz Festival. This afternoon's sessions are titled Article 10, Conversations, Women versus Culture, and we'll be exploring the complex and interrelated relationships between those two things. My name's Emma Warren. I'm a writer, and I've made a couple of books that relate directly to the grassroots venues and communities that some of the new versions of this music have come from. One of which was called Make Some Space, and the other was about Steam Down, which was a weekly jazz jam in Deptford. And so I'm interested in freedom of expression, and that relates to the title of our conversation. Article 10 of the Human Rights Act is the part of the Act which relates to freedom of expression. So we're going to be hoping for some open and honest and necessary conversations this afternoon. Each of our conversation sessions are going to be about 45 minutes long, and we're going to have some time as well for some questions. So please feel free to share a thought, an observation, or a question to any of the panelists. And if you're watching online, of course, you can also send in a question in the chat. But we're going to try and keep to time, because it's all about keeping time. And we'll have screenings in between each of the conversations. So conversation screening, conversation screening, conversation screening. And we have 6 women across the 3 panels. We have a poet, we have a pianist, we have a public intellectual, we have someone who created a festival when they were 19 years old. We've got a nightclub promoter, and we have a visual artist. So we tried to put together a group of people who represented what is obvious about jazz and the festival that happens here, but also people who relate to that subject in a broader way. Cards. So a couple of things just to say about this part of the festival. This is obviously just one part of it, and there's a whole load of other things happening, workshops, talks, events, some of which are free and all of which you can find out about online. And we would also encourage you to share any kind of thoughts and observations about today and about the program on social media. We're using the hashtag #WeAreJazz. And so before we start, there were a couple of things I wanted to share. And one of them, well, actually, just really one thing, actually. And one of them relates to Val Wilmer, who's an incredible woman who wrote this incredible book about the free jazz revolution in the mid-50s to mid-70s, mostly in America. And she quoted Clifford Thornton, who was a horn player. Well, he wasn't just a horn player, he was also an activist and an educator. And he was talking primarily about women of color. But I would hope that we can also, today, extend what he has to say to something that you'll hear in one of the films, actually, from Jumoke Fashola, where she talks about women in all their diversity. But what he said back then was, women have been important to the preservation and furtherance of the culture. We know there have been many, and there have been many. And we have 6 of them with us today, and I'll be calling 2 of them onto stage very shortly. And over the course of this afternoon, I'm going to try and collect from some of you some of the names of some of the women that you think have contributed to the furtherance of the culture. And then at the end of the day, I'll read them all out like a roll call of honor, and we can salute the women that have contributed to and furthered the culture. So if I come along and with a notebook and pen and ask you, please tell me who it is you'd have on that list. And if you're watching online as well, have a little think about who those people might be, and feel free to stick it in the chat. So I'm going to invite our guests, our first guest, to stage. And so if we can please welcome Nikki Yeoh and Belinda Zhawi, and then we'll start our first panel. Thank you. I'm sitting on the end. Yeah, so you can sit wherever you like. Okay, so first of all, thank you for listening to that introduction of sorts, and also for coming along today. We'll be talking about women versus culture, and the way in which these things intersect. And it will be interesting and useful to hear what you've got to say as well, so do feel free to chip in. Now, many of you are going to be aware of Nikki's work as an award-winning pianist and composer, and also as an educator. I've heard musicians like Nubia Garcia and Moses Boyd both tell me directly what a massive influence she had on their work and their development as musicians, mostly through the Camden Saturday Music Centre that Nikki's been running for a long time. And at the other end of our panel, we have Belinda Zhawi, who is a literary sound artist who works under the name Mamoyo. And she collaborates with a lot of the artists who are coming through from the newer wave of musicians who operate broadly in this realm that we broadly call jazz. And is also part of a very, very good collective called Born Free, which you can also find out about online. So I'm going to ask you both the same thing to start with, but Nikki, if we can start with you. You know, we're here, we're talking about jazz, but obviously jazz means many different things to many different people. It's a term with a very contested history. But when I use that word, what does it mean to you, and where does it sit in your work and life?
Well, for me, jazz has always meant freedom of expression. And for me, personally as an artist, I can't separate my identity as a musician from myself as a person. Therefore, I'm fully self-actualized. So if you take away freedom of expression for me, you take away my identity. Jazz for me is freedom of expression. Therefore, it's my identity. I am jazz, you are jazz. And the hashtag of this festival is actually We Are Jazz, but that was completely spontaneous, but We Are Jazz, yeah.
Thank you. And Belinda, what about you?
First and foremost, hashtag We Are Jazz. Yeah, jazz means a lot of things to me, and I think my definition, my personal definition of it keeps changing with time. And I think at the moment I'm thinking about it, I want to echo what Nikki just said about freedom. I guess in this case, freedom of expression, but I think jazz is freedom for me in terms of like there's so many constraints, I think, that bring that freedom. There's just like these different ways you can navigate those constraints and create such wonderful things. So for me, jazz is really like a mode of expression where I think a lot of things are allowed, but also some interesting rules that bring out the core of like whatever the message is. So yeah, that's jazz to me.
And obviously you work with a lot of different producers, artists, musicians. Do you consider yourself as part of a jazz community?
In some ways, yes, because as far as poetry goes, I'm really inspired by what they used to call jazz poets at the time. So I see myself coming in that lineage of oral storytellers. So in some ways I would say, yeah, I am, but it's not something that I'd really kind of claim. But I know that my desire to do the work that I do with music comes from these people from like the 60s and the 50s and the 70s who were working with jazz musicians and writing about jazz and trying to mimic what those musicians were doing on the page. So yeah, I mean, hashtag We Are Jazz, right? So yes, but also like not in the traditional sense of what that looks like.
Nikki, do you think ideas of what jazz is have expanded, particularly for women who are operating in that realm?
I mean, to sort of slightly contradict what I opened up saying with regards to We Are Jazz, we mustn't forget that jazz used to be used as a derogatory term for the musicians that were performing, you know, African classical music back in the day. So we always must respect that they struggled with that term, and it was a term that was given to sort of generalise about black music that was improvised, classical, intellectual music. But with regards to the kind of scene and what we call jazz now, I think things have definitely opened up for women, and I'm really welcoming that and happy to see that, because even in my lifetime, which isn't that long, it's quite a little bit long, not that long, I've seen a massive change. And when I first came onto the scene, there weren't really lots of women, and now it's becoming more normalised, which is awesome and needed, because it was one of the few art forms or places of work where equality still hasn't really caught up. So we've still got a long way to go, but there's definitely improvement.
So can we get a sense of some of the changes that you've seen in terms of, I'm imagining quite often you were in places, jams or performances, where you may have been the only female, the only woman. Can you give us a sense about the shifts that you've seen, just like on the ground?
I mean, I think everybody's experience is different, and every woman's experience is different. So I'm probably going to contradict myself again, but speaking to a couple of young women on the scene the other day, and actually there are still some common shared experiences that we have, being on the road and there's mostly guys, and certain things, boys being boys, get together, and then whereas certain conversations in an office are totally unacceptable now, those things on the tour bus aren't necessarily seen as unacceptable, and so women can still feel quite uncomfortable in that environment. But with regards to visibility, there's more of the young women musicians out there playing, and it's more people are encouraged to express themselves, whereas before it's a bit like, should you really be playing jazz? Are you, if you're not playing a piano, if you're playing drums, that's seen as like a male instrument. I think some of those stereotypes have definitely changed, and that's absolutely brilliant and needed as well, because if you can't see yourself up there doing it, if you're a young girl and young people in the audience, if they don't see other women doing it, then they don't think that's an option.
Yeah, representation and being able to imagine yourself through seeing someone doing something, it really works, doesn't it? The signal that it transmits. Belinda, what do you see on this same subject from your perspective?
I've been around long enough to know what that's looked like.
I'm asking, like, in the last 5 years, say.
Yeah. But at the same time, I do remember being a young woman who was out and about in the city and interested in this type of music, and definitely seeing a lot more men playing. And then there's been this shift, right? Then you have musicians like Sheila Maurice Gray, Cassie Kinoshi, who are like sort of, in a sense, my age mates. And it's just enthralling to see like that at the forefront, like just in terms of their projects, right? They're leading bands, But I also grew up in the Pentecostal African church, where we're playing similar music, right? Like gospel music, but some of it, like, some of these musicians. So for me, women playing instruments was never like that far-fetched, all kinds of instruments. But it was interesting for me to notice that later on when I'm out of the church, that actually it's very visible for me. I'm really clocking that, this is powerful for me, because I'm seeing, 3 women with these amazing horns standing in this image on a magazine cover or whatever, and they're young as well. So I think in many ways that's what I'm finding fascinating. I don't really think I have any like real strong opinions about that yet, but I think that it's hard to notice, and also hard to not be to be impressed and inspired to see that. So yeah, representation as well matters, but also I think there's also other deeper conversations, nuanced conversations to be had around, how it can be problematic as well. But I think when it comes to just seeing women in this space, I don't feel that. I just feel like, yes. But also at the same time, I feel like it shouldn't be that special. But sadly, we're just there where it is special,
Nikki?
I still have a problem with the term women in jazz, because to me, it's like jazz doesn't have a gender. So, and we're already, by saying women in jazz, you're assuming that it's male. And it's like people say female composer, female jazz pianist. It's like, can we just lose that identity, the gender identity attached to the art form? It's art, we don't say a woman painter. To me, it's a little bit redundant. And also, I got into playing music because I'm an artist, and not because I'm a woman. I am a woman, and I love being a woman, and I'm not ashamed of that. I embrace it. But, my spirit is an artist. So that really we need to change that too. I'm glad that we're having a conversation about women in jazz, but I'm a little bit bored with it as well, to be fair.
So why is it that so many female instrumentalists are still often mistaken as singers?
Yeah, I mean, when I was coming up, a lot of my contemporaries, like a couple of drummer friends I know, women drummers, I'm using that specifically within this context, okay, but they're drummers, doesn't matter that they're women. Anyway, you get what I mean. They would turn up to the venue with their gear, and the sound guys would say, "When's your husband arriving?" So there was still the stereotype of women having to be singers, or if you say you're a composer, then they go, "Oh, have you heard of Jerry Allen?" I'm like, "Yeah, she's great, but I've also heard of McCoy Tyner, and I've also heard of Duke Ellington." Because I'm a woman doesn't mean that I only dig women musicians as well. I love all music, you know. Yeah, I mean, women as singers, men as brass players, women not being brass players, that needs to change as well.
Belinda, just, you know, what have you observed about your generation of instrumentalists responding to that misconception? Obviously, I'm not asking you to tell anyone stories for them, but do you see a way in which the women of your moment are experiencing that or not, or responding to that or not?
Again, I can only speak from observation because I don't know the nuances of that space because I'm not really in that space always. And I find that there's an assertion there. And I guess I could just bring it a bit broader to, let's say, I know women MCs, MCs who also happen to be women, right? And when we talk about these spaces where the mic is open, or it's like a jam or an open mic, I think that's where you really kind of see what that can look like. Let's say with those friends who are getting into spaces where they want to get the mic, and you know they have to there's still that element of pushing your male friend forward to get the mic and pass it to you. But I find this assertion with these other spaces that I really enjoy because I feel like a lot of these young musicians have thriving careers, which has been interesting. So it's interesting to see how they navigate those other spaces that are removed from like their stage, where it's like a shared stage that also happens to have a lot of men on it. But I've seen a lot of grace as well. Like I haven't really, it shouldn't be like a grace situation where anyone should be able to play, but I'm still kind of clocking that a lot of the time women are on the mic singing. And I find it special when there's a woman playing within that setting who's not on the mic. So in many ways, it's like I'm digging that assertion and I'm really inspired by it and that presence, that visibility. But also at the same time, I'm still quite frustrated by the fact that it's still something that's to be noticed and to be sort of analyzed as well. You know, like, oh, damn, like she was really blowing into that sax, you know. It becomes compounded with like, you know, she's a woman and she was blowing into that sax as opposed to, so I don't know, but from what I've observed, there is definitely this assertion, this visibility, but also at the same time, I think it's still quite a thing. So I don't know how to navigate that.
If you think about, you know, sexism as a man problem, which it is really, isn't it? In the same way that racism is a white person problem, sexism is a man problem. How do you see men acting in solidarity with women in a music space?
I think they need to ask the women what they need. Then also, not all women are the same. So the more I think that it's about examining self, right? Like, what's their politics saying? Because essentially what we're discussing here is structural things, right? What's bleeding into spaces where we're still like, women this, women that. It's a whole thing throughout the world where patriarchy is just really entrenched in most aspects of our lives, really. And I think that really for me, it's about those men musicians really examining their politics and really seeing where they stand. Do they really back women? Or do they do it because they think that it looks good? Or because it will make them look like a good person, or it makes them look more spiritual, but it's really like people have to be radically honest with themselves about how they want to navigate the world and ask those people you're dealing with how they want the space to be held for them. And you'll find that with each woman that you're asking this, you're going to get different answers. So that way you diversify your palette of being in solidarity with women, because you know that women are not all the same, and they're different, and their needs are different. And I think really it's just a combination of being self-aware of one's privilege within spaces and through the world, and also just asking those people that you say that you want to be in solidarity with what they need, and seeing what you can do to help with that. That's what I think.
Yes. Nikki, again, I'm asking you this kind of like from a number of time perspectives about the way that, you know, male musicians have acted in solidarity with women, championing their contemporaries, pushing people forward equally, making space for them. How much of that might have been in people's consciousness when you began, and then perhaps we can also talk about how much of that you see now?
Sure. Well, I've been really lucky, actually, really blessed, fortunate to be in a position to have been invited by incredible musicians to perform in their bands. And I think some of those musicians have definitely been conscious that they wanted women in their band. A true pioneer for women musicians has always been Courtney Pine. I started playing in his band just before my 19th birthday, and I met him at a jam session, Jazz Cafe, Warriors jam session, and you know, he's always championed female musicians, and he was quite rare at that time to call somebody because he wanted a piano player who happened to be a woman, conscious that you're a woman, but you had to be able to cut it. He's not calling you because he wants a girl on stage. He's calling you because he wants a great musician and he wants a woman in the band. And also I work with Billy Cobham, who's also always called upon women in his bands, you know, from Sheila E., who we know from Prince's band, to Rita Marcattulli from Italy. You know, also, I mean, Art Blakey was very open. He didn't have an abundance of women in his band, but you know, I didn't work with Art Blakey, but Joanne Brackeen was in his band, and first gig she did was like a tour of Japan with him. And so I think certain cats have always been open. There have been, you know, a lot of musicians over the years who have definitely not embraced women in their bands. And up until a couple of years ago, it wasn't even expected that you should challenge yourself to think, why don't I have a woman in the band? And then, you know, with the all promoters all saying that you have to have a woman in your band in their festival, then people start to think, okay, let's get women involved. And that's been really good, actually. You're kind of making people think, you know, you need to bring a different energy. But then women don't, different energy, but yeah.
Women-y.
Yeah.
It's not just one woman.
And I do think now the new generation of jazz musicians, they're much more mixed socially and much more open, and that's really good, you know. So the guys that are sort of in their late 20s or mid-30s, I see that scene as being much more open, and there's no sort of separation between all the boys here and the girls there. So that's beautiful to see. And also, as an educator, I've seen that a lot more girls are getting involved. But sadly, at degree level, there aren't as many women taking up jazz.
Just to go back a minute to Courtney Pine, I'm just interested in the kind of qualities that he brought to the interactions with you that made it comfortable for you. Just in terms of like things that can really work. Were there specific things that he did or thought about that made it comfortable for you? Or is it simply just because you were welcomed as a musician, his bringing you in as a musician, did that work for you? I'm just interested to know a little bit more about it.
I think with any musician, when you call somebody to do a gig and you see them just as a musician and not as this, you know, entity to be treated any different than anybody else, that's where you're going to feel the most comfortable to shine and feel completely self-realized, because, you know, your spirit and your drive as an artist is to do what you do, and that's regardless of the shell that you embody on this planet, without sounding too hippie trippy. So if you're being treated differently because of the color of your skin or because of your gender or your class and all of those superficial things, really, you're not being treated as the spiritual artist that you are, then you're going to have your back up and you won't be as open. So I think any time you bring any musician in your band, you should welcome them for the musician that they are and leave all the other categories aside. And therefore, you'll all be more open and the music will sound more honest. You could connect on a deeper level. Ultimately, that's what we all want, right, is connecting on a deeper level. And the audience will always be able to feel that you have that connection too.
You've just kind of described about how having different people with different experiences in your band or in the music you make makes the music more honest. Can both of you talk a little bit more about that, about what it brings to the music and the culture to have women, because that's what we're talking about, in front of the music as opposed to the traditional role, which was much more, present but out of sight? Nikki, if there's anything else that you want to say above it making the music more honest, and then Belinda.
Yeah. Sorry, can you repeat what you just said? Sorry.
Well, really, the thing is, you've kind of answered it because you said, having different people in the band makes the music more honest and it allows for a deeper connection. Is there anything else that you think it brings to the music and culture? It's not just about doing it because it's the right thing to do, is it? It's about doing it because it serves the culture.
Yeah, sorry. For me, what I've always really been annoyed and upset about is if people call me because they want a female musician. And, especially in the 90s, I used to get a lot of calls like, we want a female keyboard player, or we want an Asian female keyboard player. I'll be like, oh man, you've already upset me on 2 levels. I don't get upset that often. I'm all peace and love. But I was like, those 2 things, I'm like, it's just not cool. Call me because you want me to play, because that's what I spend my time doing. I'm practicing because I want to play. I'm composing because I want people to play my stuff. I'm contemplating music because that's my drive as an artist. And when you say to me, I want a female musician, it's like, do you not care how I sound? You just want that look of having a woman in your band. And then you get the whole kind of contrived, let's do an all-woman band thing, which is great if everybody is really good. I was going to say badass. Can I say badass? If everybody's badass, bring it on. Bring that the heck on. But if you're not cutting it, I don't want to know, because I only ever want to hear quality. I only want to ever be involved with quality. The music has to come first, every time.
And actually, all-female bands is such a weird concept unless you talk about all-male bands.
Yeah.
Or all, long-haired people bands or whatever.
Right.
Belinda, what does it bring to the music to have people to the music and the culture, to make sure that, more people are welcomed in the music-making space?
Yeah, I really just agree with what Nikki said, to be honest. I don't really know how I can add to that, but I think it's really like when you've got good quality all around, and that connection and that diversity of perspective, you obviously can create something really special. But how do we move out of that contrived space where we're trying to fill quotas and actually get in spaces where we do nurture people from marginalized spaces to be part of the general scene? But yeah, it is interesting what you just said about an all-women band, because then it centers male bands as the standard of what a band is, right? Guys, and then Beyonce's band. It's a great band. It's a really good band.
All human bands.
My favorite,
I think that's definitely
my favorite all human band of women is But yeah.
There's a line which comes to my mind in the Val Wilmer book that I mentioned when I introduced the session, As Serious as Your Life. It's her story of jazz in America between the 50s and the 70s. And she talks about how she has 2 chapters in her book which relate to women specifically. And one of them's more about women in relationships with artists and the kind of hidden role, and one of them's more about women who dared to play in her phrasing of it. And she says something about how women who dared to play, or women who played, often ended up having to kind of double up, not on another instrument, but in a kind of maternal role. And I wonder how much you see that kind of pushing through as well. Maybe I know he's talking from she's talking from a 70s perspective, but is that something that you still recognise?
Yeah, I don't know if it's strictly in just the music space, but I think there can be some mamification that happens. I think I would say specifically with some black women artists that I've come across, myself included. I have to kind of you know, I think it comes in certain languages, or it's not intentional, I don't think, but people can cast you in certain roles, and you just have to be like, no, sorry, that's not who I am. Yeah, like people like to call me auntie a lot, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not, like, I don't even have real life nephews and nieces, so number one, slow down, and number two, I always ask them how old they are, and then I'll be like, oh, how do you feel people just calling you uncle? And then there you can kind of open up the discussion. So I don't know how to answer this one because I don't have like a great grasp of it, but it's something I've talked about with fellow female artists, specifically ones working with a lot of men in their spaces in music, and just that sort of ramification of ideas and being in, it's a lot of young women really, like when they're like early 30s and late 20s or whatever. But like I mainly have that conversation with like black women artists, and I think it's a conversation for another day too, because there's so much there that
definitely, and that's a particularly kind of ouchy, ow.
Yeah. I always laugh when they call me auntie, and I say, oh, I'm a young babe. What do you mean? Please don't call me that.
It's funny because I was asking it, expecting kind of talk about emotional support or cooking for or looking after artists who are human who happen to be men, and that kind of maternal aspect of it, you know. But actually this side of it too, that's the same thing, isn't it? But manifesting in a particularly painful and culturally specific way.
And if you were spending time with them, right, like maybe on the road, then that will probably manifest in those ways too, where you're cooking or making sure everyone's eating, or, you know, everyone comes to you with their problems, but you are not humanized in a way where you're like, I have issues too, like, I want to talk to you about these things, whatever. So I think it also just depends where you're spending time, and I feel like it manifests in different ways depending where you are. So sometimes it's just in conversation through like just ideas, or, you know, and if you're spending time together, it can spill over to just like now you're cooking and going, guys, make sure that, you know, and it's like that's not your job, right?
Yeah, thank you for sharing it like that. Nikki, what would you add to this thing of women having to kind of double, not on another instrument, but or maybe also doubling also as in a maternal role?
I haven't really found that I've had expectations of me in a maternal role, but I am a mum, actual mum. Even all my mates have said I was a mum before I was a mum. So I've always felt that, you know, if I'm at sound check and I'm making myself a cup of tea, I'll offer everybody a cup of tea. And that's because I like to make sure everybody's got a cup of tea. Because I'm like, you boys, you're not going to make yourself a cup of tea. I'll make you a cup of tea, right? But that's because I choose to do that. If there was an expectation of like, Nikki's in the band and she's a woman, therefore she needs to make the tea, then I'd probably get the tea and throw it over their instruments. Do you know what I mean? Right. So there's a
tea strike.
Yeah, I'm joking. I would never do that. Well, maybe, no, I'm joking, not really. But, you know, I think there's a difference between an expectation that the woman's going to be nurturer, or being a nurturer and being comfortable in yourself to make sure everyone's got fed, or I'm like, come on, we need to look at the menu before we finish sound check, or we're not going to eat. But then that's just a personal thing. And I can hear my manager in the back of my head saying, you're not their mum, make sure you eat, they can sort themselves out, you know. But I don't have a problem with that, because I actually enjoy that part of my womanhood, and I embrace it. But that shouldn't be the expectation of every woman, because not everybody feels like that, and that's also fine, you know.
I'm wondering a little bit about the ways in which, you know, there have been so many humans who are also women, who've had a massive part to play in this whole rich, deep, diverse culture of jazz. But often those contributions have been less well remembered than others. I just wondered what you both have to say about the ways in which, you know, we as part of the species have tended to contribute, and why you think our contributions are so easily forgotten.
Yeah, I don't mind actually, because I feel like you have way more. Yeah, because you know, I'm also puzzled. You asked, and I was like, I know, right? Yeah, because I think about this a lot with. So I did a project. I think you came to this event at King's Place where I was working with the text of jazz poets and with the band, and it was actually preparing for that one of the hardest pieces of research that I had to do, because these women were recording and putting out things since the 70s, late 60s, since the Black Arts era. And for example, Jane Cortez is an incredible poet and was also interesting in the sense that she was also married to Ornette Coleman at some point and worked with him. So I'm curious to see how that worked. But she's got this, but you can only find one album on any like streaming platform. Like on YouTube, yes, because people have ripped these vinyls or whatever and put it on there. But like on a proper official digital streaming platform, you'll find that one album. You can't really buy vinyls, you can't buy CDs of all this old work. And it's not really documented anywhere, but she's a huge part of what that movement looked like. And I'm still also asking myself that question as well. And I think for me, the only answer I can come back to is like patriarchy. Then you also have the poet Amina Baraka, who was working with jazz as well. She was married to the jazz poet Amiri Baraka. We all know who Amiri Baraka is, but we don't know who Amina Baraka is. But she's just as prolific as he was. They lived in the same home. They, went out through they probably navigated through the world together because they were married for such a long time. But again, you can only find one thing on a streaming platform. You can rarely find some of the books. So I don't really know what it is about that aside from patriarchy, because I guess it bleeds over to other sectors and industries and spaces like, the DNA situation or women discovering things and then being patented in a band's name. So yeah, I'm curious. Yeah, what else?
Do you have anything to add, Nikki?
Yeah, I mean, I was always really surprised to find out that this British keyboard player called Annette Peacock, composer, she was one of the first people ever to try out synthesizers. It was when synthesizers were like probably the size of that massive banner over there with loads of intricate little knobs on and stuff. They weren't just keyboards, and plugging in different wires, and she would spend hours and hours experimenting and making a lot of the foundations for the brilliant sounds that keyboard players use now. And she's an unsung hero, and it's only really a few musicians know about Annette Peacock. You should definitely check her out. And I hope that all of the pioneers that have preceded this generation, the generation before, I hope that we can get some kind of database together. Would be good if anybody knows musicians, women musicians, particularly women musicians. I'm using that phrase in this context, as we know. But maybe put a shout out to, let's try and get a database of all those women that have come before, have been pioneers. Let's not keep them unsung. Let's maybe put it out there now.
So to ask the musicians from different eras, who were your peers?
Yeah.
Who have been forgotten?
Yeah.
And that's a great idea.
Like Lil Harding, she was married to Armstrong, and it's like, she was just on the sleeve notes somewhere, but nobody speaks about her. Piano player,
So we're going to put out to some questions to you guys if you have anything to ask. We don't have a microphone to share, so not quite yet. But when you do have some questions, I can repeat them back out again. But before we get there, Belinda, I noticed that you made a post recently about Alice Coltrane, calling her your fairy godmother. And I just wondered why. What is it about her in particular that makes her your fairy godmother?
So for me, I think the spirituality of the music means a lot to me. And I think as somebody who was mostly raised on spiritual music, not allowed to listen to that secular drivel from outside the house because it doesn't glorify Jesus. So my relationship with music has always been, and also singing in the church choir many years ago, it was never an idea. It was always these ideas of like, it's not entertainment, it's about sort of ushering people into a particular space within themselves. And I think I brought that to my poetry performance practice. So there's just something that feels quite sacred about Alice Coltrane's music, and I find that it puts me in this very meditative state a lot of time, but not necessarily like peacefully, like, but there's a lot of her work is really dynamic in an interesting way, and I'm just curious also about people who work with different tools, but trying to put forward the same idea. So I know she was a pianist at the beginning. I was trained as a pianist, and then picked up the harp, which was, I guess, John Coltrane's harp. And I find that fascinating, and then I find that retreat into this ashram life even more. It's not really my flex. I'm not really gonna go off to an ashram and but I find this dedication to making music that's not for a particular kind of consumption, but for specific other kind of use really interesting, because I think this really echoes some of the ideas I was raised with about the role of music in everyday life and in spiritual life. So she means a lot to me in that way, because it's also, she's a musician I wouldn't have been allowed to listen to growing up because she's not making Christian music. So, but I'm able to make those parallels later in life as an older person with my own experiences. So she means a lot to me as an artist, but also as a spiritual person. Yeah.
And Nikki, you know, like we all know about the concept of a patron saint, but like, who would be your matron saint?
I think there are several, actually. So when I was coming up, I first heard this piano player called Joanne Brackeen, and I was absolutely blown away. She has this incredible independence of her left hand and right hand, pianistically speaking, and she can keep a groove like in 7 going and improvising over the top in different time signatures. She's an absolutely amazing composer. She's also a mum. She had 4 kids with Charles Brackeen, saxophonist, and so she had to take time out to raise her family, and then she went back to playing. And actually, through my journey as a person, as a woman, as a musician, raising my son, who's now 17, I've seen the challenge to my creativity along that journey, purely based on time. And if we're talking about your hierarchy of needs, if you don't have enough sleep and you need to earn money, creativity can often be the last thing you're thinking about. And I think there's a different challenge for women, not that it's only our job to raise the kids, but that's a different conversation. But I think there is a different drive sometimes at different parts of our life when we're focusing on nurturing. And sometimes for me personally, my creativity was a little bit more scattered when my son was little, because he was my creative project, my main creative project. And so thinking that Joanne Brackeen had 4 children and how she navigated those 4 creative projects and then came back to her other artistic drive, I've got maximum respect as a woman for her and as a musician. So she's one of them. Others I can name: Rachel Z, Terry Lynn Carrington, Esperanza Spalding, Jerry Allen. There are some great musicians out there, but I think Joanne's journey really resonates with me on many levels.
Thank you. So does anyone here have anything they would like to, any observations they want to share or chip in, or questions that they have for any of the panellists?
There's a lady over there. There's a lady there.
Oh yes, please, go ahead. I think you're behind. Oh, I see. We'll just ask a question and I'll repeat it back. So the question is referring to this question of wanting to be chosen to play in a band or to be part of a musical community because of your artistry, not because of your gender. And that if you do that, then that might allow for rooms which are all male or just have one particular kind of gender perspective in the room on the basis that they're the best players, and that how can we protect ourselves against that? Yes.
It's something that I really struggled with when I first started playing, and actually a lot of the contemporary female musicians that I've spoken to of my generation, we all felt that we had to be better than the guys in order to get the call for the gig. So, you know, practice that bit harder, be that bit tougher in a way. So, you know, you could fit in and do the gig and not make any mistakes. And I think that there's a problem there, that there has been traditionally, don't know if it still happens now, but there's been a safe space for men to get together and play and make mistakes. And what that does is it allows you to hone your craft. Whereas if you're only given an opportunity now and again to prove yourself and you make a mistake, then you're judged on that mistake. And then it's already assumed, oh, it's because she's a woman, she's not very good. I don't know if that still exists now in this generation. I think there's a bit more open. But that definitely was an issue when I was coming up. And it's the same for my contemporary piano player, Zoe Rahman. We do a duo together. And we speak about that quite a bit, actually, about having to make sure we're super on it so no one can say she messed up because she's a woman, you know. Part of that is because people would also assume sometimes that you got the gig purely based on the fact that you're a woman. So I know when I got the call to do Courtney's gig, and also Zoe did that band, it was like some of the musicians would be like, oh, she only got the gig because she's a woman. You know, a little bit of resentment there because they didn't get the call. Whereas actually you might just get the call because you're good. And personally speaking, I only want to get the call because I'm good. Because that's, you know, ultimately what you strive for as an artist, right? So, but yeah, if the only prerequisite is that you're good and then people can just call their mates and then the same old, then it doesn't change. So having initiatives where there's an incentive for band leaders to have a woman in their band has to happen now in order to break through those preconceived notions that the woman won't fit in, she's going to stop the kind of all boys together kind of vibe, or she's not going to get the music or not be able to cut it. You know, all of those negative preconceptions. I mean, I love men. I don't think there's a lot of men that I work with that are actually really of that mentality anymore. All the men that I work with, I have to say, are super, super cool. And sometimes you actually get those preconceptions from other women, you know. So it is a people problem. It's not just a man, woman, or, you know, female problem. We all need to see women musicians just being musicians. And yeah.
Belinda? Nothing more to add. Okay then. Any other observations, thoughts, little nuggets you want to throw our way? Yes.
Would you like to use my mic and then give it back to me? Yeah? Come on. Yeah, raise your hands.
Hi. Thank you for everything today. Because you mentioned motherhood, and I think it's something that whether one wants to be a mom or not, obviously is a personal choice, but is sometimes at the back of their mind for a lot of women in art, not only in music. So I was wondering if you could share more of your experience, your struggles, as well as maybe the perception of the scene for women that decide to be moms or not.
I mean, for some people it isn't a decision. And
Yeah.
Sei italiana? Ho pensato. Parlo italiano. Mamma mia. No. Right. Yeah, for some women it isn't a choice, you know. Not all of us have the choice. But yeah, I think there needs to be more of a discussion about being a woman and being an artist. And a lot of that comes down to practicalities. And I've attended a few different talks, actually here at the South Bank, that the fantastic Gillian Moore has put on with for female musicians to sort of have a chat about what the challenges have been for us. And for me personally, it was a really practical thing of like, I would love to have gone to a few rehearsals or, you know, composer get-togethers, but there was no creche available. Am I going to bring my 1-year-old into this meeting and they might start crying? So maybe little things about thinking about making it easier for young mums to be involved. Also, you know, freelancers. Most of us musicians are freelance. So being aware that there might need to be financial support for female artists because they might need to take time out to compose, but maybe there's a longer time you could commission a female, a new mum to write a piece. So rather than having like a 6-month deadline, they could be given a year to write their piece so they could still be creative. You know, I think also the taboo. I know a lot of orchestral players have often said, and a lot of other musicians have said, they've not mentioned the fact that they were pregnant because they might not get called for the next run of shows. And I actually lost out on a commission to write music for a film when I was pregnant. And I think I was about 5 months pregnant, and I had a conversation with the guy on the phone, and he said, oh yeah, we really, really want you, Nikki Yeoh, specifically to write for our film. And I was like, that's so cool, let me see the film. And it was like an amazing film. I was like, I can do this. I love the film. I can hear it. I'm ready. And when's your deadline? He told me the deadline. I knew I was able to meet that deadline. Then he heard through the grapevine that I was pregnant, and I lost the gig. And because it's a freelance world, you know, he's not held accountable for that. There was no contract. It was awful. And I thought, well, I know me. I know what I can deliver. But you've decided within your power that you don't want me to do that because I'm pregnant. And for some reason, you think my pregnancy is going to affect my ability to compose. So, you know, maybe if there were more conversations to find out what, you know, young women or women that have had kids before would need, that could be really cool to make sure that these things don't happen for the next few generations that come up. But overall, you know, being a mum and being a musician has been brilliant because I could do the school run, go home and write, or go off and teach, or prepare for a gig, and then do the school run, pick him up, and be a mum. As far as he was concerned, I was really just a mum who played a bit of piano now and again. Yeah.
Little did he know at that point. Thank you very much for asking that question. It's, I know it's not easy to ask things always. Is there anyone else who has something they want to throw our way?
Any men would like to ask a question?
Yeah. Oh, yes, okay. Here we are. You can have my mic this time.
Hello. Thank you for sharing incredible insights. And I'd be really interested on any observations or experiences of the upcoming generation. So I don't know, you mentioned teaching, maybe you're interacting with teenagers and people are just entering into the business. Are you seeing differences in their attitudes and orientations and like actually how what their expectations are, like how they're going to be treated relative to the experiences that you guys have been sharing?
What I find, like, even I could talk about today, I was teaching my group today at Camden Saturday Music Centre. I've been teaching there for 25 years. I started a jazz course there literally from nothing. And when I first started teaching the jazz course, it was mostly boys that turned up because it was, you know, stereotypically, not all boys, but a lot of boys are happy to practice in their room, play through stuff all the time. And they become really, really good at that. Teenage boys, it's like the teenage male brain is wired towards that. Actually, I see that with my own son. He's into film, so he's happy to sit there and edit for hours and hours and hours. And girls don't always work in the same way. We might do a little bit, then do something else. Our brains work, not every girl, but most of the girls I teach, we've been talking about how we practice. And you still get the same results, but it's just a different kind of thing. So what I've seen is that the male kind of locker room mentality of we are boys, we rehearse and practice in this way. Girls are not really invited into that space because we are boys and that's what we do. I think that's changed a lot in the last, maybe I'd say 8-9 years even. And today it was just wonderful to see all my kids who was very mixed class in Camden, it's boys and girls. Between my 2 sessions of advanced group and an intermediate set, I encouraged them to have a little bit of a jam session on their own without any teachers in there. And all the boys and girls were hanging out together, and I came up the stairs from after my break and they were all glowing and everybody's involved and they're just all a bunch of mates. And I think there has been a culture shift, I think, where that this generation are very much like, yeah, we're just all hanging out. There's more conversation about gender identity as well, and I think that's really helped everybody of this generation, all the young people, because they're like, you know what, it's not such a big line down the middle of you are boy, you are girl. It's just a bit like we are people. So I'm really positive about the future generation of musicians. If they keep on communicating and socialising in the way that they're doing now, from what I can see, then it's going to be fire in the next 10 years. We just need a few more girls to be involved. A few more girls. Please, get your girls playing jazz. And still encourage your boys to do that and get them all to do it together. It would just be awesome.
And Belinda, what do you see in the spaces where you are, whether it's Born Free or a jam somewhere?
Yeah.
Maybe tell us where the places are that you're going to so people can...
Yeah, so where are some of the places I'm going to, did you say? Yeah, so I really echo what you're saying about there's been a shift in how we talk about gender, sexuality, gender relations, you know. I just feel like the kids are not having it. Like, they're just not having it. You can't, you know, I know the word woke has been appropriated by a certain group of people to mean what it doesn't mean. But its previous meaning is actually really positive, right? Which is like seeing through the system and being like, I'm not asleep to the mess that you're trying to give me. And basically they're woke, like, they're waking, I don't know. But there is a normalcy around talking about these things that I think maybe even when I was growing up, and I'm not that much older, but I think it's a slightly different generation. But I think access to information has really helped in terms of like how people navigate safe spaces. Accessibility is very important, like people take that seriously. Conversations around gender and acknowledging people by the pronouns that they want to be acknowledged by. So I think when you're already engaging in this type of dialogue, it's also quite easy for that sort of those sexist wired things that we have in our brain to kind of like also be challenged and pulled apart, really. But I'm not saying things are like great, but what I've observed is that when I was a younger artist, I started performing for people about 12 years ago. It doesn't feel as comfortable as it feels now, you know, like walking to a space where they're older men or, you know, working with other people who are not my gender or people who are non-binary. There's just more fluidity, to be honest, for me anyway, which I think for me makes me feel more comfortable in many of the spaces that I'm a part of, because I don't really feel marginalized because of my gender. But it doesn't mean that things are perfect. But I think there's been a deep shift just because we're having different conversations now.
Definitely. I was speaking with a 13-year-old daughter of a friend of mine, and I just said to her, how common is it for you to ask people their pronouns? And she was like, always.
Yeah, like,
just like it was completely normal. So I think you're absolutely right. That dividing line between us and them on gender identification has just opened up, and it's not perfect. But I think your point about, you know, this image of your class this morning and the glow that they all came out with from being together, playing together and benefiting from each other is a really lovely point to end it on. So thank you both very much for that. And thank you for your questions and for listening as well. And
Thank
the
you,
next
Emma.
thing, that's my pleasure.